Okay, so here we are in a new section in the class. So we're going to move on to chapter 12, which is going to really kind of combine these little bits that we've been learning over the past few weeks. So we have a bunch of models of the labor market, of the credit market, some understanding of the Federal Reserve Bank and the type of things that they're able to do in the banking system. And what we want to do is to kind of put all that knowledge together in one framework to sort of analyze what's going on in our economy. And ultimately, the labor market is going to be kind of one of the more important models for understanding this here in this chapter. So what we're going to look at are what I call short-run fluctuations. So we've got our standard learning objectives here, quite a few of them again. We'll go through them one by one. There's questions associated with each learning objective, and there's a homework assignment posted, and you'll kind of notice as you go through the learning objectives, those questions kind of follow pretty closely the various learning objectives. All right, so just to kind of introduce the topic, so this is a graph of the unemployment rate over time, at least since roughly 1945. And what you see, obviously, is that there's been lots of ups and downs in the unemployment rate over time. So you've got all sorts of various what we call recessions, which we'll define a little bit more specifically here. But these little areas where you see the gray bars that go vertically, those are recessions. Those are periods when the economy isn't doing all that well. And you notice the unemployment rate tends to go up in those recessions. And so we've got a few periods here in the early 1980s where the unemployment rate was almost 11%, and most recently just over 10% in 2010. And so we have these big fluctuations in the unemployment rate, and we want to get a better understanding of what causes those and to what extent various policy measures by the Federal Reserve Bank or by the federal government can alleviate some of those concerns. Now, something that's very important, particularly for us. So typically, as I've gone through the semesters, I talk about these changes in the unemployment rate, and they don't particularly resonate with a group of young students. And the reason is that, in the sense that you care about the unemployment rate, it's always been low for your lifetimes that you remember, right? So for the past number of years, the unemployment rate has been below 5%. And it was most recently 3.5% as of March of 2020. Now, I want you to notice there was already an increase at the end of March in the unemployment rate. And when we get the numbers in April, it's going to be pretty shocking. So don't be surprised. It's actually going to go well above the graph. My sort of read of it is that we'll be at an unemployment rate of probably at least 16% at the end of April, if not higher, and probably going to go even higher than that. So these are relatively unprecedented times in terms of how quickly this unemployment rate has gone up. So if you notice, in the past, those changes in the unemployment rate have happened over the course of a couple of years, or at least a year. And we're going to go from an unemployment rate of 3.5% to probably over 15% in 1 month, which has really never happened in history before. So this is a very interesting time indeed. We want to try to understand a little bit about what's going on here. And so our first learning objective is just to define and understand some parts of a business cycle. What do we mean by that? And so the key thing to note here is that if I took a broad view of GDP, so you just kind of look generally what's happening over time, is that GDP is increasing over time. That's what this red line here represents, is the trend in real GDP. And for the most part, the blue line is more or less inseparable from the trend. So when I look at GDP over time in the US, it is an increasing trend pretty clearly. On average, we're producing more stuff. We're having higher incomes. Now, one thing that's worth noting, it's very smooth along the red line, except we obviously notice this big decrease around 1930. That's an event called the Great Depression that we'll talk more about. And then we see a subsequent quite large recovery in this next period, which was following World War II, in and around World War II. So that is interesting. But outside of that one huge blip, which is what we're going to see again in the graph in the next few months, it's a fairly long-term increasing trend. Now, if we were to zoom in on any 5-year period, 10-year period, we're going to get something that looks much more wavy. So I'm going to try to draw a picture here of time and real GDP. And so we had our trend, which was the general increase in real GDP over time. So our incomes or standard of living is increasing at roughly 2% per year. If I was to zoom in on that blue line, it would have a much more distinct wavy feature around the red line. Now that was obvious around the Great Depression, but in the other years it wasn't that clear. We'd have to zoom in much closer. And it's this picture that defines a business cycle. So an expansion is simply increasing real GDP. So an expansion is this part right here, where GDP is increasing. We hit what we call a peak, which is the high point of real GDP in that cycle. Once we hit the peak, by definition, that's the high point. It has to decrease from there. The decreasing part is called a recession. Decreasing real GDP. And then we eventually hit what we call a trough, which is the low point. And so our objective here in this part of the class is to understand sort of what are causing, or what's the nature of these fluctuations, these ups and downs. What is causing those things to happen? And so we'll kind of go into some of the details, but that gives us a little context and a few basic definitions to speak the same language when we reference business cycles, expansions, recessions, booms, and contractions. Those are all similar terms that we'll use to describe these fluctuations around the trend.